Dave Chappelle is the baddest person to touch a microphone that's alive right now.
Dave's a beast, man. That's the only man that puts a little fear in my heart. I'm like, okay.
He's fucking amazing. How are you that funny at 2 a.m. in front of a crowd that gave up on the show like an hour ago, and they're tired and they just want to go home? That second he steps on stage, boom, he just like...
Every night before I come out on stage, I'll be backstage like, I'm sure this is going to go well. And it always does.
And what's the deal with lampshades? Yeah. I mean, if it's a lamp, why do you want shade?
Doing a Jerry Seinfeld impersonation is pretty fun. Jim Carrey had a great impression of him as he rose to stardom in the sketch comedy TV series In Living Color, imagining how Jerry would react if he got lost in a bad neighborhood.
Why do they call it bum rush? Who's a bum? What's the rush?
Of course, there's nothing inherently wrong with being easy to impersonate. Every comedian has a style, and style can be exaggerated. Many comedians even joke about their style.
I will now recede back into my stage persona.
Jerry Seinfeld's real problem as a comedian, he says, is the attitude of the audience. He seems to constantly run into the issue of being introduced as the greatest comedian of all time, nearly ruining his sets because of the attitude change.
The audience just went, oh, really?
I know.
And it was over.
It makes sense to want the audience at ease and not against you.
You always undersell a comedian.
This idea of needing to undersell a comedian also brings up the issue of celebrity and how a comedian can struggle with relatability after gaining so much wealth and fame. They might reference their fame, but most of the time they try to keep that everyman feeling to the joke.
All the things you do, I do a better version of all those things. And it's only for another year at the most, believe me. It's not gonna last. It's been about 8 months, I got a year left, and then I'm back to being just like you.
But one thing a comedian like Jerry Seinfeld has no problem with is people stealing his jokes. His joke writing is so incredibly meticulous that it's almost impossible to copy without obviously taking it from Jerry. His love has always been in the joke itself, and it's what he relies on.
I've probably been working on this for 2 years.
But almost every other comedian struggles with this issue.
Poltergeist is good. Well, you need your friend, though, right? Like, you're fucking him from behind, and then you sneak out, and he takes your place.
Guy number 1 runs outside, knocks on the window, waves to the girl.
As David Brenner famously said, if we could protect our jokes, I'd be a retired billionaire in Europe somewhere. One of the issues with joke telling is that you can steal it. There's also comedians that struggle to adapt their style as they change. Eddie Murphy was a stand-up champion during his SNL tenure, but as he became a movie star, he essentially abandoned stand-up. Some comedians can address personal issues in their comedy.
If you're being entertained or are laughing at what is supposed to be terrifying you, it just takes all of its strength away.
You can't laugh and be afraid at the same time, is what I like to say.
Yes, exactly.
Well, you're not doing this
unless
alone.
You're on bath salts.
That's true.
But I think Eddie Murphy didn't know how to do that. His style that made him so famous couldn't really address personal issues that well. He wasn't introspective on stage. He was fun and light. And there's nothing wrong with that, but as his lifestyle changed, he became a superstar. After some box office disappointment and a personal scandal, it would have been odd for him to perform stand-up and completely ignore those things. So he probably would have had to completely change his stand-up persona, and he chose not to. Every living comedian struggles with one of these problems. They each have one of these labels: easy to impersonate, trouble with audience attitude, joke stealing or stolen from, or trouble adapting their style. But there's one comedian alive right now that doesn't have a single one of these problems.
Chappelle is just different, man. Like, he cannot be copied. You cannot steal anything that Chappelle does. His style is it's like a UFC fighter that crawls on the ground and hits over top of the head. And
now, I'm not suggesting that Dave Chappelle is the funniest comedian or that you have to like his jokes, but what I am suggesting is that Dave Chappelle does not operate like other comedians. He has the gift of ambiguity. He's the one true chameleon comedian, and as a result, he can approach jokes in a totally unique way without falling into the usual problems for comedy. In short, he can dodge the laser beams. But what does that mean? Let's start with an isolated example. There was some controversy over Dave Chappelle's transgender jokes in his first Netflix special.
Let's go to the club and trick niggas into fucking us. Yeah.
The offensive idea here is that transgender people can never honestly express their sexual identity to a man, and it implies Chappelle is a little disgusted with the idea of transgenders. So how do you deal with telling a joke that offends people? Some comedians apologize. Other comedians like Bill Burr don't reflect on the problem with what they say and can rely on their raw talent and thoughtful arguments to keep up the laughs.
They're just jokes, Martha. Come on. You got an empire. I'm rooting for you.
But what does Dave Chappelle do? In the very next special, he picks apart the controversy and what he said before.
You know who hates me the most? The transgender community. Yo, yeah, these motherfuckers. I mean, I didn't realize how bad it was.
He doesn't apologize, but he also doesn't dismiss the issue. He actually digs deeper.
I did something that many black men in America do not have the time or the money to do. I thought about how I felt.
Among the most successful comedians, Bill Burr probably deals with being too offensive the most. And I think he partly started his podcast because it was a way to express himself without a crowd.
You feel it now? They're getting they're backing off. Like, is he saying there's something wrong? I'm saying no. She was dressed ridiculous. The woman who happened to be a lesbian, it was funny the way she was dressed. Jeez. I'm going to be washed up in 6 months.
But instead of owning his joke or secluding himself, Dave Chappelle reveals the root of his transgender comments. He describes sleeping with a transgender person and how he's conflicted at being attracted to them. He blames himself and his own insecurities for the fact that he's slightly uncomfortable with trans people sexually.
And then the lights came up and I saw them knuckles. I said, oh no!
So he rearticulates the joke to make it about his own flaws and not about problems with transgender people.
It's the madness of youth. Types of mistakes that a man makes when he's young. I wouldn't even know that it's necessarily a mistake. It was a wild night out.
Chappelle deals with backlash on this joke like nobody else would. He digs deep into the root of that joke to honestly see if the joke had a mean spirit to it. And he admits that it did, and he finds the humor in his mistake. He puts himself in a potentially disastrous situation, and he narrowly dodges the issue by making it about himself in a way completely unique to Chappelle. He does this kind of reflective humor with a lot of his personal controversies too. Instead of ignoring his controversies or defending them, he admits to them and owns the controversy, always giving it a personal anecdote.
The article goes on to say I was booed off stage, which is also incorrect. I was booed. I did not leave.
His jokes don't ignore the fact that Dave Chappelle is almost always in the news and has had an extremely successful and controversial career. And he has no problem discussing his controversies and the backlash.
I said, I'm like Evel Knievel. I get paid for the attempt.
One thing that always struck me as odd with huge comedians is their need to remain an everyman. These top comedians make millions of dollars and can't possibly have a normal life because of their fame. When Kevin Hart jokes about his latest parent-teacher conference, can you not help but wonder how Kevin Hart can do anything normal? His comedy largely ignores the fact that he's such a super celebrity. But Dave Chappelle is a completely different story. After becoming one of America's most famous comedians, he left the public eye for over 10 years. As a result, he has the bizarre ability to operate outside of the A-list celebrity life while still being one of the most famous comedians of all time. Within the same year, he can say this.
It's okay, my career ended many years ago.
And then win a Grammy.
I am honored to win an award, finally.
He's also in this weird limbo of being one of the most famous comedians of all time while also operating outside of the Hollywood sphere. Chris Rock has a great joke in his recent Netflix special about his fame.
Yeah, I'm famous, but I'm not like Michael Jackson famous. I'm not famous from miles away.
And it ends up being a good joke, but notice how the premise still puts him as a sort of humble underdog. Dave Chappelle doesn't do that.
And he recognized me immediately. Oh, Dave Chappelle. And I looked at my friend like, we getting out of this shit.
He has no problem talking about how famous he is, how much money he has, or how talented he is. He doesn't worry about getting the audience on his side much at all. He puts himself in this dangerous position of having the audience turn on him, but he always gets around that issue.
You know what's weird? I've always been this talented.
He said that within the first few minutes of his special, and he really stands apart from his contemporaries in this way.
I've been doing this for 32 years now, and it's been 32 years, and it's been going great for 4 years.
The only other comedian I can recall really bragging about how good they're doing is Anthony Jeselnik, and it's a big part of his personality on stage.
I'm like 8 minutes in. CD's already gone gold.
But he relies on the jokes and timing, and there's nothing wrong with that, but Dave Chappelle doesn't have to.
In having this discussion not so very long ago with Jerry Seinfeld, he said that when he's in a situation where he senses that things are not going his way is when all he does is rely on the material, and sooner or later he will prevail. Do you have that experience?
Not at all. Oh, no, it's good. I don't have any material. That stuff's for pussies.
Another odd ambiguity in Chappelle's comedy is his racial humor. In his earlier comedy and his show, he always separated black people and white people behavior.
White people do not like to talk about their political affiliations. Black people talk about that shit. Black people openly talk about politics. Black people openly talk about beating up politicians and shit. If I see George Bush, I'll kick his motherfucking ass for cutting my Medicaid.
And the jokes are funny, but it's a pretty standard and familiar style.
Black guys drive a car like this. Ding, 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 ding. Yeah, but white guys, see, they drive a car like this. It's
true. It's true. We're so lame.
The reason he left the Chappelle show is partially because of these kind of racial jokes going too far, saying that jokes on his show became socially irresponsible and he was being laughed at instead of laughed with. Back then, he hit the laser beam.
I mean, I don't want black people to be disappointed in me for putting that out there.
But in his latest Netflix specials, he's adopted an entirely new kind of racial comedy. Notice how his racial jokes aren't just white people versus black people. He has a much more ambiguous approach to race. He acknowledges how he doesn't quite fit into the typical black upbringing he jokes about.
A lot of people think I'm from the hood. That's not true. But I never bothered to correct anybody because I wanted the streets to embrace me.
He actually didn't even grow up in a black neighborhood.
My parents did just well enough so that I could grow up poor around white people.
He carries that ambiguous identity with him in all his new specials, joking both about his wealth and privilege.
I know that rich white people call poor white people trash. And the only reason I know that is because I made so much money last year, the rich whites told me they say it at a cocktail party.
While also defending his roots.
If you don't understand that when a football player takes a knee during the national anthem, he's actually standing up for me, then you might not want to fuck with me anymore.
Because as a rich comedian, he's embraced how in many ways, his lifestyle is not much like the typical black American.
I was the only black person in the restaurant. And in the 90s, that felt very uncomfortable. Now I tend to enjoy it at this age.
But he still doesn't ignore his racial identity, not at all. He spends a lot of his new specials talking about very serious racial topics, and he earns what he says because he uses his comedy to discuss the complications of race instead of simplifying them like so many other comedians. His more thorough exploration of race allows him to get deeper into racial issues, as opposed to the surface-level observational comedy of his earlier years. And the fact that he sometimes does become serious makes his absurd punchlines that much more unexpected.
And I said, wait a minute, ladies, you know what? I think that you're both right. And what I was doing when I said that was preserving the possibility of a threesome with these bitches.
Dave Chappelle, through his life and through his comedy, has molded into a persona that doesn't make sense on the surface. He's famous, but he doesn't talk it down like other comedians. His style constantly adapts as his career takes unimaginable twists and turns. When he's offensive or controversial, he openly discusses the issue with his audience. And sure, there are comedians that can do some of these things, but I can only think of one comedian alive today that can do it all and avoid getting hit.
I said, you guys would do that for me? And the whole crowd said, hooray! I said, come on, y'all. I look like Malcolm X going to see Brother Johnson with a trail of white people.
He just tap danced over 6 laser beams. Yeah. That's what we like about that joke. Okay. Yeah. Look at that. He didn't touch one laser beam.
That's right. Bam! Ladies and gentlemen, I told you I'm dope, nigga.
A big thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. If you want to make a website but don't want to spend a ton of time coding, Squarespace is perfect for you. Their templates work for any kind of website you would want to make. I could use one of their award-winning templates to start my own film blog, but it also works if you're an artist or a musician or just about anything else. Go to squarespace.com/nowyousee-it to get a free trial and 10% off your first purchase. Use this link to start a website today in just minutes that looks professional and is easy to use. Thanks for watching.
Singing my life